Hi, I'm Gabby from Earth Resus team at Birmingham. It's really nice to meet you.
My name's Honey Smith. I'm a GP. I've been a GP for more years than I care to remember, and I also work as a GP educator and in sexual health.
Would you mind just telling us a bit more about who Greener Practice are?
So we started off as a local group in South Yorkshire, mainly Sheffield. So Greener Practice is a network of GPs that formed about 4 years ago. It was formed initially by two of my wonderful colleagues called Artie Bansal and Amar Rugani, who had a conversation in a pub and realised that they were both very passionate about the climate crisis as a health crisis, but they realised that there was a big kind of gap in the information and support that was out there for GPs specifically, because they were very much aware that there was some work going on in hospitals and some sectors sort of led by the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare. Places like renal were doing quite a lot of green wards and so on, but there was really a very patchy information and awareness in the general practice sphere.
Yeah.
So Greener Practice was set up specifically to fill that space, to be a kind of one-stop shop for GPs to come and get advice and support and to start on their decarbonisation journey, really.
Were you involved in the setting up of Greener Practice at all, or is something you've joined slightly later on in the process?
Yeah, so I joined after the first meeting. Just by chance, I happened to mention at the university when I was at the university, so I really wanted to do something with medical school education on the climate crisis as a health crisis. And one of the people in the academic unit of primary care said, "Oh, you need to meet Artie Bansal." So that was how I met her. So I was involved from the second meeting. So I was very closely involved right from the beginning, really.
So what sort of inspired you to go along to the meeting? Have you always been passionate about the climate crisis?
I mean, I think this is quite an interesting story because I think it's quite illustrative of what happens to people. So basically, my trajectory was that I've always been concerned about the climate from being quite young, being worried about the effect we were having on the natural world. But when I was younger, it was very much about the effect we were having on nature and wildlife. That was my focus when I was younger, and actually still is. I mean, I still think that's absolutely right. But when I moved to Sheffield, I was beginning to become aware that it was a health issue, but wasn't really very well informed about it. And then I attended some course at the university to shadow somebody who was doing some education on it. And I felt as if I'd been hit by a truck. I suddenly realized, oh my goodness, this is huge. This is just way beyond what I'd realized. The devastating effect on human health. It was so devastating. And I suppose it gives me a lot of empathy for people who are struggling with this. I was just incapacitated by fear and depression. It just made me feel that I couldn't do anything. And then I kind of went through a process of thinking, well, even if I can't change the medical world and its thinking, I've still got to do what I can in my private life to decarbonize as much as I can. So I started cycling much more. I dropped my meat consumption even more. I just was doing things in my personal life that were taking me on that journey. And actually what happened when I did that was that I just became more and more hopeful. Being active dispelled some of my fear.
And maybe some of the guilt as well.
And some of the guilt as well, exactly. And then that allowed me to come back into being active in the medical world. And it was really meeting Artie Bansal and Amar Rugani and the rest of the very small team that kind of made me think, no, this is really worth fighting for. And we all have to be part of the solution, because if we're not part of the solution, we're part of the problem. Yes, if I stop to think about it, I'm still really fearful. And in a way, there isn't really any space for that, because I'm busy taking action and trying to address it, so that at least I can say I did what I could.
Would you mind telling us a little bit about the work that you've been doing for Greener Practice and the work that Greener Practice does in general?
So our focus was on trying to support the decarbonisation journey for GPs. So it was around encouraging GPs locally to use a tool that was created by the National Union of Students, which I'm sure you'll be aware of, which has then been adapted for the Royal College of GPs to decarbonise in general practice. So all sorts of initiatives in the clinical realm and the non-clinical realm. We've been trying to engage with the various sort of organisational structures in the general practice world. So primary care networks, clinical commissioning groups, which are now morphing into integrated care services, trying to link in with people in Sheffield who offer discounts on e-bike, block contracts for energy efficiency and things like that. Inevitably, what happens is that some of those projects succeed, some of them fall by the wayside, and you don't quite know which ones are going to take off until you try. So that was how we started. It was really with a local focus. And then actually it's just got bigger and bigger and bigger. When it came to the Royal College of GPs elections, we noticed that the people who were applying to be in the Royal College on the council, Not one
Yeah.
of them had mentioned the climate emergency. But the good thing was that we sent them we just sent them a message saying, so
Yeah.
I notice you haven't mentioned this. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
And that prompted a little flurry of activity and kind of really put us on the map. Actually, it kind of made
Yeah.
the college aware that we existed, and
Hmm.
actually then people really started to talk about it. And on the back of that, we were encouraged to ask the Royal College of GPs to declare a climate emergency, which they did about 3 years ago. And then we've been involved in the process of helping them to deliver on that plan to decarbonise. These things sort of have a habit of, the more you put yourself out there, the more doors begin to open, the
Been
more
open.
connections you make. So we've been very involved at local level, doing all these sort of initiatives, working with a medical school to encourage their medical school education, as I say, working with GPs to decarbonise locally. And actually what's happened is increasingly we've become a national voice. So there was just us as Greener Practice South Yorkshire. There was another one group in Wessex called Green GP Wessex, and there are now 11 groups across the country as a result of the networking that we've done. So we spoke at the Royal College of GPs annual meeting about 2 years ago. As a consequence of that, we got a whole load of people onto an email list. We've got about 230. We put them in touch with each other, and then eventually you get enough of a hub that they form their own group. That's been one of the most exciting things, is to see new leaders emerging in all these different areas, and really inspirational people starting to lead, starting to come up with their own ideas. We've cross-pollinated the things that are working and learning from each other about the challenges. We've also now got several WhatsApp groups which talk about various sort of special interest things that we want to take further. So, for example, the organisational systems in the NHS, how do we influence them? How do we reduce the carbon in the sort of organisational structures within practices? How do we reduce carbon use in clinical care and in respiratory care, because that's a major hotspot. And we're now going to have national meetings for the leads of all those groups and the leads of the local groups across the country. So it feels as if it's kind of taking off into this real movement. Actually, it's really exciting to see that happen. We are still hitting quite a lot of barriers, but we're definitely kind of pushing with more energy behind us now, which is fantastic.
And I guess the culture of learning in the NHS as well must really drive it along, because everyone is constantly looking for the new thing to improve or new thing to reflect on. So it probably has helped, or would you say not so much?
Well, that's a bit of a double-edged sword, because of course one of the problems is COVID's been a double-edged sword. COVID has both made people realise that things can be done differently. And of course, some of the things that we've seen change, like remote consulting, have been in some respects good for the planet. People are incredibly open to new things. There's probably no organisation in the world that changes as much as the NHS does. The idea that we're laggards and we don't like change is nonsense, actually. But at the same time, we are dealing with a workforce who are exhausted, who are at capacity or beyond capacity, actually, who, with the best will in the world, have a lot of other priorities. And one of the biggest challenges, they know that the climate crisis is a priority. You and I know, and probably most of the people watching your videos will know, it is the priority. There is no other priority that makes any sense, because if we don't deal with this priority, none of the other priorities is in any way manageable or reachable. For people who aren't as climate aware as we are, that's a challenge, because they see it as another thing that they've got to interweave with other priorities. So they don't see it as the overarching priority. Yes, they are very up for innovation, but they're not necessarily seeing things through a sustainability lens. That's the biggest challenge.
Would you say the plastic waste in hospitals in the past year or so has been so blindingly obvious that everyone's chucking away masks and stuff? Have you noticed that there's been more awareness raised about the interaction between healthcare and its impact on the environment? Do you think that this very obvious problem is now raised awareness, or is it not have that benefit?
Again, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because I think, yes, at one level it has raised the issue. I hope that in healthcare settings people are aware COVID is part of the climate and ecological emergency. I'm not entirely sure that message has got home, but I hope that people understand that it's because we put so much pressure on the planet and natural habitats that this has happened, and that it's one of a series of zoonotic diseases which are only going to get worse. I think you're right about PPE. I think that has definitely, people are horrified at the waste associated with PPE.
Some of the ways in which healthcare impacts the environment are much more subtle, like in terms of like anesthetic gases and just even transport.
So absolutely right that much of it is much more subtle and much less obvious. So we have meetings with people, for example, from our integrated care system, who are thinking about the climate crisis as an emergency, but their focus is to, for example, reduce the energy output of buildings in general practice. And then the next thing would be to help anything that reduces our prescribing, which is good for, I mean, it's win-win solutions. If you look at actually where the hotspots of carbon are in general practice, it's all clinical. So 40% or thereabouts of our carbon footprint is created by prescribing. All solutions like active travel, physical activity, exercise in nature, mindfulness, all of those kind of things that actually reduce our need to have medication and are good for people in a myriad ways. But actually getting people to grasp that is quite a challenge. So yes, absolutely, that's one of the most difficult things. It's a drop in the ocean compared to what needs to be done.
Continue on the COVID theme. How's your work changed since COVID started?
Initially, I think it completely distracted us. I think all of us were finding we were so overwhelmed with the amount of information we needed to hold on to, with the massive challenge of PPE, and knowing that we just had to begin with to just let that one go and accept that that was a cost to the planet that we couldn't do anything about. And then after a few months, I think we then really started to get focused back on, okay, this is the new reality. We have to now use this as an opportunity to build back better. And we were really focused on building back better within the healthcare sector to see if we could learn good things from this, but also overcome some of the increased challenges that have been presented to us. As a profession, we've been thinking a lot about what we do in terms of remote consulting from here on in. I think that's a really interesting debate about what we do about that and how we reduce patient travel. And from a greener practice point of view, it's doubled our commitment, really. It's made us even more aware of the urgency and the scale of the issue that we have to face. And as well as the very painstaking work we've done of building relationships with people in local areas, I think the other thing that's brought people on board is, as you say, the COVID has possibly focused people a little bit more on the climate crisis.
What would you say is the biggest challenge facing sustainable healthcare and achieving carbon neutral?
I'm not sure I could name one on its own. I think the biggest challenge is the political will to make this happen. If we had politicians who were leading from the front and really actually walking the walk, we would take with us the population. You either have a population who pushes the politicians into do it, or you have the politicians who push the people into doing it. The change is happening, and the public actually do want action on this, but they still are waiting for the politicians to actually do something. That's coupled with a lot of stuff about inequalities, because inequalities are going to be exacerbated by the climate crisis. But often the people who are talking most about the climate crisis are people in positions of higher educational levels and so on. Whereas actually it's going to affect the people at the poor end. I think the messaging around this is really a challenge, because we have difficulty making it land with people in a way that really engages them to actually take action. I think they're all surmountable, but we have to keep on working on the best ways to communicate this to people, and finding the right language that appeals to people's values, to what's important to them.
Any suggestions for the viewers of this video? How do you think they could change what they're doing in their personal lives, but also particularly as professionals?
I mean, I guess the first thing is we're mainly talking at the moment about healthcare students. We're talking medical students and associated. So from that point of view, before you qualify, the more you can raise the issue with your universities about how to educate the medical student population on the climate crisis. So the more that can happen, and you can, I'm sure you'll be familiar with the Planetary Health Report card. And one of the things that kind of came out of that is that the best people to lead on this is the medical students themselves. If you can, as when you're in your careers, get yourselves into positions of some form of authority. If it's general practice, the local medical committee, the Royal College of GPs, BMA reps, etc. I can tell you from my own personal experience, you don't need to be good at medical politics. You don't need to know anything about the structures of the NHS. What you need is for people to be sitting in those committees saying, how is this going to affect our climate? How can we find solutions to this problem? And just keep on asking good questions and get yourselves into positions where you can influence. And I know diddly squat about medical politics or anything. I just, that's not the important ingredient. The important ingredient is that a climate voice, voice for the planet is there at every table. There's somebody speaking for the planet. The other thing I would say in terms of what I would say for your group is talk about it. Just talk about it constantly. I'm sure you already do this. there's some really good stuff on climate communications made by, is it the Climate and Health Alliance, I think it is.
I'm so inspired from everything you said, and also some really great advice about how we can do more and grow our society as well. It's been really, really great. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's lovely to talk to you. It's really
Lovely
great
to
to hear
talk to
about
you.
another
Yeah.
organisation that's, doing fantastic
Yeah.
work.